I've pushed the button, but make sure it's pointed in the right direction.
Okay, everybody, so welcome to the Maker Talks, 8 of 9, day 2. Please can you put your hands together for being able to.
So, I'm going to try and talk today about a whole bunch of stuff that's right in front of our noses that we don't normally pay attention to, because we're normally looking at the wrong thing. So, I'm going to point at some things, and from that, I'm going to try and draw a line which indicates a slightly different way of seeing the world, and some implications that arise from that. So, the thing that I'm mainly going to talk about today is a technology called blockchain. And you've probably heard of this in the context of a thing called Bitcoin. Could you raise your hands if you've heard of Bitcoin? Okay. Does anybody feel like they really understand what Bitcoin is? Okay. So a few hands, but basically you've heard of it, but it's very mysterious. So the first thing that I'm going to try and do is make Bitcoin a little bit less mysterious, which is a bit complicated because it is hairy and weird and very, very strange from a whole bunch of perspectives. It's a genuinely alien artifact, possibly literally. Then I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about the invisible processes that make the world that we see around us, and how this Bitcoin-like technology could impact those invisible processes. I work for a company called Consensus Systems, and Consensus works with these technologies. So I've been around this stuff for a while, and it's kind of interlocked with my earlier work on things like disaster relief. There'll be a picture that comes up eventually, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. So, in the beginning, in the 1970s, we invented a thing called the database. There were kind of previous systems in the late 1960s, going back to the far back to the 1950s, but the database, as you know it, comes out of IBM in the 1970s under the guidance of a mathematician by the name of Cod. And Cod figures out that you can use multi-dimensional algebra as a way of organizing information. You wonder why they didn't get around to that earlier. Well, it turns out to be quite difficult. What comes out of that is an abstraction called SQL, which is basically that you have a bunch of things that look a lot like Excel spreadsheets, and these things that look like Excel spreadsheets are interlinked to each other. So you have a customer table, and the customer table links to an invoice table, which links to an order table, which links to a product table, and the things are all interconnected. And this is called the relational model. And the relational model comes to define more or less everything that happens with computers for the next 20 years or even longer. And the relational model is the core thing that all of our big institutions are built on. Inside of your tax offices, inside of your corporations, inside of your companies, inside of the departments, even inside of big websites, you'll always see this thing called an SQL database, and it's big, and it's fragile, and it's expensive, and it's complicated, although there are open source versions which are also very common and have different properties. But things like Oracle, if you've heard of Oracle, huge computer company, that's what they sell, big databases. At the time, you typically have one computer per company. And the computer has to be protected at all costs because no computer, no company. It's impossible to stress how fragile they were in those days. You know, the data was stored on magnetic tape. If you got a hair in the tape, it would screw up the entire tape. You could even destroy the machine that the tape was running. So they literally wore white coats and little hats. You know, that image you have of like ancient computer technicians, it was all done that way for a reason. You get along to the 1980s. Mid-1980s to late 1980s, you get the microcomputer revolution, and on the back of that, you get the computer networking revolution. And the microcomputer is an appliance. It's got about the same dynamics for having one in your house as a microwave. You plug it in, you turn it on, it's there. It might as well be a TV set. They're not fragile, they're not horrifically expensive, particularly as they get little. And the computer networking is built around the idea of lots and lots and lots of cheap appliance-like machines that you could connect together more or less any way you like. If something goes wrong, you just turn the machine off, you turn it on again, you don't really care. It's not like you've screwed up your 1970s database or your company collapses, you just turn the box off and on again. And that model, where the computer is a thing you can treat casually, turn off, turn on if there are bugs, you get over it, you can restore it from backup yourself, one per desktop, the computer is your machine rather than being the company's machine. All of that thinking becomes the network mindset that explodes in the 1990s after Tim Berners-Lee invents the web. But because of the cultural difference, and I stress this, it's not just technical, it's cultural, between the computer people of the database world and the computer people of the microcomputer world, the desktop world, the network world, the networks and the databases never work together smoothly. They're always broken, they're always disjointed and disconnected. And you see this because every time you go to a company, say you're doing something like an insurance claim, how often are you going to have to type your name and address into different computers to get that entire thing done? 4, 8, 10 times? You know, the bank needs it, the insurance company needs it, the other insurance company needs it, the police need it. You go a little further, you know, something goes wrong, it gets referred to another department, they want you to type it all in again, over and over and over again, the name and address to win. That's happening even though you're using the internet to connect to every single one of these computers. On the back end, they're not connecting to each other. So you can't just give your name and address once, and then all of the other computers talk to each other to pass the information around. You have to go to every single website over and over again and type it in. And this is because the big computers, the databases that run these companies, don't connect easily and casually to the other computers. Right? The databases and the networks don't work smoothly together, and you can see this all over your life. Once you learn to recognize it, like, okay, so inside of this company, inside of this system, there's a big database, there's a network on the front of it that's connecting it to me, but it's not really connected to everything else I'm doing. You begin to see this pattern everywhere. It's how your stuff works. Come a little further, and you get to where we are now, right? 2010 and onwards, you get the invention of this thing called Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin is a weird thing. What it does at a technical level is very different from the way that it was discussed, the way that it was sold, the way that it became known. At the technical level, Bitcoin is a solution for this network and database disjunction. Right? The fact that these things don't work together, the Bitcoin guys fix. And what they produce is a thing that has all the properties of the network and all the properties of the database and all the power and sophistication of a pocket calculator. Right? It's a tiny little slow computer that does about 7 transactions a second. And what it does is it creates a shared picture of the world. So everybody that's connected to the Bitcoin network sees the same data, and they can update their data inside of this shared pool that everybody else is connected to. And there are enormous computer security processes going on in the back end of it to make that possible. But that shared model of reality is so powerful that what we're sharing is our bank balances. So if my account says I have 4 Bitcoin, and I send you half a Bitcoin, the entire world knows that I had 4, the entire world knows that I sent you half of the one, the entire world now knows that you have 1.5. Right? And that information being shared all over the world without having an enormous computer sitting in a bank somewhere to do the job is incredibly revolutionary. It doesn't have much impact, but all you can do is send money around, because at the end of the day, it's the smallest thing that you could possibly have a computer do. It's just adding and subtracting. And that's all the Bitcoin network does. It adds and subtracts. It's a very simple system. Not much is going on. Along comes a thing called Ethereum, which is the thing that I work on. Ethereum is a very different thing, because rather than being a little pocket calculator that runs on this thing called a blockchain, which unifies the network and the database, it allows you to write programs. So now we've got the network, the database, and then the network, and then the programming language, all tied together into a seamless whole. And it's still quite slow, and it's quite new, and it's a little fragile. But that system allows you to have a shared picture of reality in reality's full richness and complexity. So it is databases, it's networks, it's transactions, and it's code, which means that you can write programs which share their state over the entire world. They can't be shut off because there's no single computer that runs it. It's across all of the computers in the entire network, And the programs can do anything that you want to do because anybody can take a program and write it. They're typically quite short right now, 20, 30, 50, a couple hundred lines. And you can then upload it into the system, and that program can directly handle things like payments. So there's a simple instruction that says, ask for funds. There's a simple function that says, send funds. You put these things together, you have a sort of internet of programmable money. But money is not that inherently interesting as a thing for computers to do. It can store records that you need to be unique and in one place at a time, like your name. So every time you go to a website right now, you have to look to see whether your username is free, right? And every website has its own database of names, and you always think, well, what if my name is already taken? I'm going to be Simon Jenkins 2416544 again, right? So one of the things that you could do with this is you could generate your own name on the internet using a thing called name registry. So it's a little bit like a domain name, but it's a domain name that you don't necessarily have to pay for. And it's a domain name that you can use at every single site that you go to. So in theory, in a few years, you could have the same name everywhere you go on the internet, and that name belongs to you. So your Google username is Google's property. Your Yahoo username is Yahoo's property. Your Facebook account is Facebook's property. You don't actually own these things, although they're quite central to your identity. If you woke up one morning and Facebook had gotten rid of your profile and Google had forgotten who you were and Yahoo no longer acknowledged your existence, a huge part of your life would have vanished, but you don't actually own that data. As soon as you type it into their computer, it's their data. Right? And you see those pages of legalese you click through on the beginning of a website, you go to it. Those are the legal structures which make that data their data. They make that name, your name, their name. So if we move into a world where this so-called blockchain technology is a big deal, you get a very different kind of situation. In that world, your data is your data, and you publish it onto the network in the way that you choose to, and then companies that want to come and serve your needs ask to use your data, they ask for your permission. If they're selling advertising to you, they might even have to pay you for the advertising. If you don't want to see the advertising, there's a simple mechanism where you can pay them to show it to you because you're paying for the service directly. Once you've got a world in which everybody has their own name, or as many people have their own name, it could be connected to their mobile phones or to their computers, it would manage their money, it would manage their bank accounts. At this point, you have a kind of sovereign citizen. You've got a person who owns their own name, they have their own banking system, it's all tied up in this big network. But inside of that big network, there's no central point of control because there's no big singular database where everything is run from. There's nothing to shut down. And what you have at that point is a sort of global citizens registry. It's the same kind of registry that the government keeps for you as an individual inside of your country, but instead it's been constituted directly from the will of the people, and it is for the entire world, and it costs essentially nothing to use. And the prospect that you could have kind of global citizenship based on these kind of technologies, drawn directly from the individual person's own authority, rather than constituted from the authority of the nation state, is why I call this talk the political internet. It's a genuinely revolutionary possibility. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is the thing that we need. The reason we need this kind of stuff to emerge is that as the world is right now, we don't have a very good handle on things like climate change. The system of international relations that we have at the moment is about 200 countries. And I quite often refer to these as flags. You have 200 flags, and all of those flags represent a little piece of the world, and they get to vote at the United Nations because they have a flag. You're sort of magically able to vote at the UN if you're a country. If you're not a country, you can't vote. And the UN is one vote per flag, so big countries with huge populations have no more voting rights than little countries with tiny populations. It's basically a labour union for nation states. And the boss countries and the worker countries and the unemployed countries all have the same number of votes. But there's no real flag for the world as a whole. And there's no flag for the world's citizens as a whole or even individually. So you never see a flag for the entire planet because there is no political representation for the entire planet. And if there's no political representation for the entire planet, it shouldn't surprise us very much that the planet gets left behind. Right? Every time there's some kind of debate or argument about how the world should be run, the planet comes last because the planet has no flag and there's no organization that directly represents the planet's interests. The planet is not represented. And this is why it's hard to get any kind of coherent action on things like climate change. Even worse, nanotechnology and biotechnology are very dangerous to the global ecology, and these are technologies which are being developed particularly by the big countries and their defense establishments, without any real thought to the long-term impact of those technologies on the planet. If there's a biotechnology accident involving a major food crop like wheat, somebody comes up with a wheat that's supposed to be disease resistant and turns out to be vulnerable, you could have enormous global impacts that come from that, but there's no real sense of the entire world getting an opinion. If those decisions are being made, they're either being made by large, powerful countries, or they're being made by the UN. Or occasionally, you get special purpose global bodies that are convened to handle these things, like the World Bank. It's not actually a part of the UN, but it's a part of the same set of structures. So, if we're going to get fair representation for the planet, it might start with fair representation for the planet's people. And what I'm suggesting is becoming technically possible is a global democracy in which you could have one person, one vote, and those votes would be recorded using the same basic ledgers, these blockchains, that are in the future going to be used to record an enormous amount of the world's financial transactions. So you wind up with a single system that is both managing the world's money, potentially managing its democracy, and also perhaps tracking its natural resources. If you have a single record that the entire world shares, where you can see that somebody is mining carbon and burning it and putting it into the atmosphere, it becomes possible to imagine regulating those practices for the entire world because you can see where it's happening and then you can collectively decide to stop it. So political representation at the planetary level requires global participation from the people as a whole. And the only technology I can see that has a realistic chance of doing that is the internet, particularly the internet on mobile phones. There are enormous unsolved problems inside of that. How do you ensure that you get one person, one vote? How do you get any kind of global consensus on when the elections will be? Who gets to set up the systems that bring this into being? I don't think those are questions that are going to be answered inside of this generation, because those are genuinely hard questions, and they're questions which are not really about the technology. They're questions about human society, they're questions about human will, they're questions above all about formation of agreement and consensus. So I can think of one approach to this that might work and might be worth a try, which is we basically pull some ideas from opinion polling. When you're doing an opinion poll, you don't actually have to get a vote from every single person in the country to get a reasonable idea if people like an idea or not. If you ask 1,000 random people what they think of something, and 999 of them hate it, you're fairly sure that if you ask the rest of the country and your sample is really random, you're not going to discover that everybody else thinks it's a fantastic idea. So we could have a system of global democracy which was just advised, just for discussion purposes, in which you take as many people as you can get in the world, and you select them in a manner which is statistically as random as you could make it. So if you've only got one person per million with an account in China, and you've got one person per 1,000 with an account in New York, you have to bias your selection processes so that you, as far as possible, select the Chinese people in a random way, as often as you select the New Yorkers in a random way, relative to the number of people they're representing. But as you get more and more and more people with phones and more people signed up, you could get this kind of sampling process to be reasonably representative, and you could take good statistical models of what the global population are like and where they're distributed to fine-tune the models. You can then start asking people questions. And if the question is kind of somewhere around 50-50, you might say, well, we don't have enough statistical evidence to say which way the people want this to be, but we do know for sure that the question is contentious and the people are split. For things which are completely obvious and the entire world agrees, this could then become an input into the regular, ordinary, nation-state level democratic processes that we use every day to govern our lives. So what I'm suggesting is you can start a global conversation with these strong feedback loops that show you what the world thinks of your opinion relatively early. long before you have the integrity and trust in these systems where you could begin to build a real political power structure, we can still start the political discussions, and we could gradually get to know what the world as a whole thinks about a whole bunch of the important issues that face us, without necessarily having to have that opinion-forming process directly linked to the creation of new political institutions. And if it turns out that after 10 years or 5 years of this regular polling process, you begin to see a strong agreement forming the global community that certain things are necessary and must be done, maybe that then becomes an input to the national politicians who then run for election, partly on whether or not they're willing to follow the global consensus on critical issues like climate. Now, that sort of structure might or might not be compatible with a lot of the values that we hold. The world is comprised of people that are both like us in some areas and radically different from us in others. They have values that are completely different from ours in many countries. China, Africa, America are completely different from us in some really fundamental ways. Things that we assume would be completely ordinary here would be seen as bizarre there and vice versa. For example, being able to see a doctor anytime you want to see one without having to pay has been a hugely divisive political issue in America for 20 years, and you still can't do it. So inside of this world, one of the things that we'll see first is that the world is genuinely diverse, and there might only be a handful of things that the human race as a whole agree on. But I bet that a lot of those handfuls of things, many of the core issues that we do agree on, would be things like we should protect the climate, we should have a fair way of deciding how we're going to protect the climate, we should be careful in nanotechnology and biotechnology so we don't destroy the world. And if we had a global political voice that made those values clear to the entire world and all of its politicians and businesses, all of its universities and all of its labour unions, we might be able to get people to actually go along with those big global agendas and mandates without needing to be led one step at a time in the ballot box. Thank you. All right, do we have time for questions?
We do, yes. We've got time for questions. If anyone has anything, you can put your hands up. I can give you the mic, or you can just go for it.
Okay, I just want to point out something about this flag. You often see Earth flags, but they have a blue background. And I wanted something that looked like the Earth from space, but I still haven't found an Earth flag with stars. So if anybody knows how to get custom flags made, I want one like this, but I want it with a realistic background of stars, ideally directly from an astronaut's picture. Okay.
That's your homework. Is that a hand? Yes. Good. Come over here. Well,
how widespread and how successful, how popular is Bitcoin at the moment? We're hearing a lot about it, but it's not clear, for example, how quote-unquote official it will be regarded in any ways, or what its trajectory is like. It seems like it's taking off, it's exploding.
Yes, well, I mean, right now, if you took all the Bitcoin in the world and you sold it, it'd be worth about $6 or $7 billion. So that gives it a kind of value in total, the same as quite a lot of large companies, but the biggest companies in the world are still 10 times larger than Bitcoin is. So it's still quite small, but it's also become a hugely galvanizing force inside of science and technology, because so many people are really fascinated by it, and an awful lot of smart people have migrated towards it. And then this blockchain technology, which is basically the Bitcoin minus the American libertarian politics. So you've got a whole kind of new wave of work on it. So this kind of technology is likely to continue to move forward, if only because of the brain drain into it.
Bitcoin. There's also Dogecoin, if you like.
Oh, yeah. Hundreds of little cryptocurrencies, all interconnected.
Yeah.
Hey Vinny, I know you've done some stuff around smart contracts, you mentioned that in passing, and I know you've done some work with Imogen Heap, and I think I just want to be reminded of that, and I think other people are really interested.
Oh, sure. So, does everybody know Imogen Heap, the English singer? So, Imogen Heap is a project called Mycelia, and Mycelia is an attempt to redesign how musicians get paid for their work. So right now, if you're a musician, you take a payment, it bounces around 4 or 5 other organisations before it reaches you, and they each take 10%. And by the time the payment is actually delivered to you, it's often 2 years after the thing that you're getting paid for was done. So needless to say, this makes life very hard for musicians. and she's attempting to streamline that. So you have all the contracts for who gets paid for what are stored on blockchains, they're all fully transparent, and then you make a payment, the payment just automatically flows through the contracts in real time, and you get paid 5 minutes after you did the performance. And there's a lot of hope that this would enable many more musicians to make a living doing music, because instead of having half of the money evaporate and be essentially taken by payment processors, you would get all of that money going to musicians. So a lot of people that are currently making music but can't make a living could double their income and become professional. Sounds good to me.
Yes. I'll pass it via friend here. Thanks, friend.
Thank you. So I love your vision of a global democracy. I was wondering if you could just say a few words about how you see some of the other sort of prerequisites for that coming into being, so particularly the more widespread access to the internet, and also sort of education levels that would let people understand some of these issues. And I'm saying this as somebody who's recently moved to Ghana and co-founded a makerspace there, and so I'm very interested in the issues of spreading technology around.
Yeah. So I'm fairly sure that network access will sort itself out quite quickly. The phones are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The network providers are providing 3G, 4G, 9G, anywhere they can. The networks are turning out to be surprisingly robust. After the Haiti earthquake, we got the cell network back up in 72 hours, and it was rock solid after that. It's amazing. The education thing is a much harder question. So we have to face the fact that our democracies were originally elitist institutions. Yes, there were votes, but there were only votes for a specific class of people, usually landowners. Partly that was because it made it easier to maintain the voter rolls, so people weren't voting 9 times, you just gave the vote to the landowner, you knew who that was. But it was also part of this idea that you had to be an educated elite before you were going to give you political power. One of the things that we have to face when we start talking about this kind of global democracy is that if we believe in democratic principles, we have to let ignorant people vote too. Right? And that question about whether we really believe in democracy or whether we want democracy with limits is a very deep question. The American founding fathers wanted democracy with limits, and the limits were in 2 forms. On one hand, they limited who could vote. On the other hand, they limited what you were allowed to vote for. So they had a constitution that was a list of principles that the government was never allowed to contravene. For example, the right to free speech, the government simply had no power to make a law that restricted free speech. So if over the course of the next 20, 30, 40 years, we move towards global democracy that has real rule-making force, one of the things you might want to consider is a global constitution. But how do you constitute a global constitution when the people of Earth agree on so few things? So for now, I think we're at the discussion, debate, deliberation phase of the democratic process. Over the course of some period of years or even generations, we might come to some very broad-based global agreements about deep principles, and from that you can imagine constituting the beginnings of a world government. Whether this is a good idea or a bad idea is an open question. Right? But right now, the problems that we're having in the international system as it stands make it clear that something has to change. And I would say that global democracy is a thing that we should consider, and we can see over time whether it turns out to be a good idea or a bad idea. There might be 50 different approaches to this vacuum at the top level, but one of those approaches is certainly a super state. And in the short run, I would say focus on the genius kids in the poor villages. Self-educated by Wikipedia. I grew up in a small town in Scotland in the 1970s. 3 hours a day at Open University before I went to primary school. And that was how I got an education. I'm sure they're doing that today on the internet.